It started so subtly that I barely noticed. At first, I dismissed it as the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. Rachel and I had been together for nearly 10 years, and life inevitably shifts: careers, responsibilities, routines. But then the changes became too distinct, too sharp to ignore. Small things, insignificant on their own, began to form a pattern that gnawed at the back of my mind, like a splinter you can't quite reach. It was in the way she touched me, or rather, how she didn't anymore. Her hands, once so familiar, had grown distant. When we kissed, it felt rehearsed, something we both did out of obligation rather than affection. She'd pull away too quickly, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Distracted, maybe, or perhaps guilty. The late nights at the office started coming more frequently. Rachel had always been dedicated to her work, but suddenly there were meetings and urgent deadlines that kept her away longer than before. When I'd ask about her day, she'd give vague, almost rehearsed answers. There was no warmth in her words anymore, just a tired recitation of facts. Then there were the phone calls. At first, I didn't think much of it. People have lives outside their marriage, after all. But she had become increasingly protective of her phone, carrying it with her everywhere like it was glued to her palm. She never used to care about leaving it around the house. Now, if it buzzed and I happened to be nearby, she would snatch it up, claiming it was work, an old friend, a relative, always some perfectly reasonable excuse. But the excuses wore thin. The phone would light up in the middle of the night, a faint glow in the darkness. And she'd check it, even at 2 or 3 a.m., tapping away with a furrowed brow while I lay next to her, pretending to be asleep, my mind racing. Who texts someone at that hour about work? I tried to brush it off. We all have stressful periods in life, I told myself. But it wasn't just the phone. She started dressing differently. I noticed the shift in her wardrobe, new clothes that were more form-fitting, stylish, almost flirtatious. She began wearing a scent I didn't recognize. I'd catch glimpses of her in the mirror, adjusting her blouse or reapplying her lipstick before heading out for work dinners, which seemed to happen more and more often. It was like she was preparing herself for someone, but not for me. The tension between us became palpable, like an invisible wall growing thicker with every passing day. I'd try to initiate conversations, but she'd always be too tired or too busy. When we did talk, it felt forced, like we were two actors playing the parts of a happily married couple rather than being one. The easy laughter we once shared was gone, replaced by awkward silences and quick exits. I began to replay everything in my head, searching for the moment it all began. Had I missed some sign? Was it something I had done, or maybe something I hadn't done? I began to wonder if I had failed her in some way. Let her drift so far that she found comfort in someone else. But every time I tried to bring it up, she'd brush me off, insisting everything was fine, that I was overthinking things. But I wasn't overthinking. I knew something was wrong. Something had changed in her. Or rather, someone. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in ways that made me sick to my stomach. The late nights, the secretive texts, the distant touches. She was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I was left alone with my suspicions, unsure if I was ready to confront the truth but terrified of what I might find. Each day, I'd watch her more closely, searching for clues, for confirmation of what I feared. I hated myself for it, hated the growing paranoia, but I couldn't stop. It was as if a switch had flipped in my brain, and I couldn't unsee the signs. The woman I had loved for a decade was slowly becoming a stranger, and I felt powerless to stop her from disappearing. The worst part? I didn't even have proof. Not yet. All I had were the nagging thoughts, the gut feelings, the small cracks in her behavior that hinted at something darker beneath the surface. But deep down, I knew. I could feel it, like a storm brewing on the horizon, waiting to break. And when it did, I knew my life would never be the same. It was a quiet evening, one of those rare moments when the house felt almost peaceful. Rachel had been home earlier than usual, which was itself a surprise. She had prepared dinner, something she hadn't done in a while. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if things between us were finally settling down, if the distance I had been feeling was just a phase, nothing more than the wear and tear of a busy life. After dinner, she excused herself, mentioning she had some emails to catch up on in the bedroom. I stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up, and enjoying the calm. That's when I saw it, her phone, left carelessly on the counter. Normally, she was so careful with it, always keeping it within arm's reach. But tonight, she had left it behind, like an afterthought. I stared at it, my heart starting to race. There it was, right in front of me, unlocked and unguarded. I told myself not to look, to respect her privacy, but a stronger voice inside me was screaming that this was my chance. The gnawing suspicions that had been plaguing me for weeks surged to the surface. I couldn't help myself. I needed to know if my fears were justified. As I reached for the phone, my hand trembled. The screen lit up, revealing a fresh message. It was from someone named Oliver. The name didn't immediately register, but then I remembered, a student. One of my students. I had seen him before in my classes, though I never paid him much attention. I assumed it was just a routine message, maybe something about an assignment or an academic question. But the words on the screen hit me like a punch to the gut. Can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again? Closing parenthesis. For a moment, I just stared at the message, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Last night? What had happened last night? The flirty tone, the suggestive wink, it all pointed to something more than just casual conversation. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Oliver, my student. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, her sudden interest in looking her best. She hadn't just been distant. She had been seeing someone. And not just anyone, a student, one of my students. A cold wave of anger and disbelief washed over me. I felt like the ground beneath me had crumbled away. My legs threatened to give out, and I had to steady myself by gripping the edge of the counter. My chest tightened, my pulse racing in my ears. How long had this been going on? How could I have been so blind? I knew I needed to keep reading, to see how deep this went, but I couldn't bring myself to scroll through the rest of their conversation. The mere sight of his name on her phone made my blood boil. My eyes flicked up to the doorway, half expecting her to walk in at any moment and catch me. But the house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. My mind raced with questions, each one more painful than the last. What exactly had happened between them? Where had they met? Was this the first time, or had it been going on for weeks, months even? The worst part was knowing that I would never have suspected Oliver. He was just another face in a sea of students, someone I barely noticed. But to Rachel, he had become more than that. Much more. My hands clenched into fists, the phone still glowing in front of me, taunting me with its simplicity, with the casual way she had spoken to him as if it were no big deal. As if I didn't exist. I couldn't think straight. 1,000 emotions surged through me, rage, humiliation, confusion. I wanted to confront her right then and there, to march into the bedroom and demand an explanation. But I also knew I wasn't ready for that conversation. I needed to calm down, to think clearly before I did anything rash. But how could I? How was I supposed to act as if nothing had changed when, in reality, everything had? I placed the phone back where I had found it, carefully, as if it were something fragile that might break. My hands were still shaking. I felt hollow, like someone had ripped out my insides and left nothing but a shell. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to make the pain go away, but all I could do was stand there. Paralyzed by the weight of what I had just discovered. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I had a plan. Not until I knew how to deal with the situation in a way that wouldn't tear my life apart even more than it already had been. But the seed had been planted. Oliver, Rachel, my wife, my student. The betrayal was so complete, so unexpected, that I didn't know where to begin processing it. All I knew was that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. As I stood there, staring at her phone, I realized that this was only the beginning. The discovery was an open wound, and I had a feeling it was about to get a lot worse. After discovering the message from Oliver, my mind became consumed by suspicions that I could no longer ignore. Every time Rachel left the house, every time her phone buzzed, I felt a surge of anger and fear. It was no longer just a question of, what if? I knew something was happening between them. But a part of me needed undeniable proof. Something more than a single suggestive message. I had to see it with my own eyes. A few days after the discovery, she told me she had another work dinner. Her voice was casual, almost too casual, and my stomach churned. I nodded, pretending I believed her, playing the role of the unsuspecting husband while a storm raged inside me. As she left, I waited a few minutes, just long enough to make sure she was truly gone. Then, I grabbed my keys, threw on a coat, and slipped out of the house. I followed her, keeping a safe distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The whole time, my mind raced with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Part of me hoped I was wrong, that maybe I had misunderstood the message, that there was some innocent explanation for all of this. But deep down, I knew. I had known for a while now. After about 20 minutes of driving, her car finally pulled into the parking lot of a small, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place couples went for privacy, away from the prying eyes of colleagues or friends. My heart sank as I watched her step out of the car, glancing around as if checking to make sure she wasn't being followed. I parked my car a little further down the street and sat there, my breath coming in shallow bursts as I tried to steady myself. She walked inside, and I waited, giving it a few moments before I got out of the car. I moved quickly but cautiously, my legs feeling like lead as I approached the cafe windows. Through the dim glow of the candlelit tables, I scanned the room until I saw them. Rachel and Oliver. They were seated at a small table in the corner, secluded from the rest of the patrons. A candle flickered between them, casting a warm glow over their faces. My stomach dropped. There was no mistaking the look on her face, the way her eyes sparkled as she smiled at him, the soft way she leaned in as if the rest of the world didn't exist. It wasn't the look of a woman having a business dinner or a casual meal with a friend. It was the look of a woman lost in someone else. A woman who had forgotten entirely about her husband. About me. Oliver was leaning in, too, his hand resting casually on hers. They were speaking in low voices, smiling, laughing in a way I hadn't seen her do in months. The easy, familiar intimacy between them was undeniable. It was like watching a scene from a romantic movie, except this wasn't a movie. This was real, and it was my wife sitting across from another man, her fingers entwined with his. My heart clenched, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I stood there, frozen, watching them from behind the glass, feeling like I had been punched in the gut. My chest tightened with a pain so sharp I could barely stay upright. A wave of nausea rolled over me as the full weight of the betrayal crashed down. I wanted to burst through the door, to confront them both, to scream, to demand answers. But I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the ground, and all I could do was watch, paralyzed by the scene unfolding before me. It felt surreal, like I was outside of my own body, witnessing a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My hands trembled at my sides, balled into fists so tight my nails dug into my palms. They were so wrapped up in each other that they didn't even notice me. I could have been a ghost, invisible to them, watching their secret unfold from the shadows. The sight of her, so open and carefree with him, felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Every soft smile, every lingering glance, was another reminder that I had been replaced. My wife was sharing her affection, her attention, everything that had once been mine, with him. Guilt, anger, and heartbreak swirled together inside me, and I didn't know which one to grab hold of. The pain was almost unbearable, but the rage was building too. How dare she? How could she look at me every day and pretend nothing was wrong while sneaking off to be with him? How could she sit there, laughing and smiling, while I was breaking apart inside? They stayed there for what felt like an eternity, locked in their little world of stolen glances and whispered promises. I don't know how long I stood outside, watching them. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. Time seemed to stretch, the air around me thick with the suffocating weight of their betrayal. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked back to my car, the sounds of the cafe fading behind me as I stumbled away. I felt hollow, like all the air had been sucked out of me, leaving nothing but a cold, empty shell. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Should I confront her? Should I confront him? Should I let her know that I had seen everything? But no, not yet. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to face the full reality of what this meant for us, for me. I needed time to think, to plan. I needed to figure out how to make them both pay for what they had done. As I drove home in silence, the image of them together in that cafe was seared into my mind, a constant reminder of the betrayal I could never unsee. The night I saw them together, something inside me shifted. The initial shock had worn off, and in its place, a cold, calculating rage began to take hold. I had imagined a confrontation, a scene of fury where I could lay bare her betrayal and watch her crumble under the weight of her lies. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that confronting her would give her control. She would have explanations, tears, excuses. She would make herself the victim in some twisted way. And I wasn't willing to let her have that power. No, confronting her wasn't the answer. I needed something more, something that would leave a lasting impact on them both. That's when it hit me. Oliver. He wasn't just some random fling, some faceless stranger I could easily dismiss. He was one of my students. A fact that had once seemed like a cruel coincidence was now a weapon. His academic future was in my hands, and with the exam season fast approaching, I realized that I could destroy him without ever lifting a finger in confrontation. The thought was intoxicating. I kept my discovery to myself, burying it deep under a mask of normalcy. Every morning, I'd sit across from Rachel at the breakfast table, pretending everything was fine, my heart hardened by the knowledge of her infidelity. She had no idea I knew, and that ignorance gave me the upper hand. She would smile at me, and ask me about my day, and all the while, I was plotting. With each passing day, my cold resolve grew stronger. I started noticing things about Oliver in class that I had never paid attention to before. The way he would confidently answer questions, how he seemed to carry himself with a sense of entitlement. He had always been a decent student, clever but not exceptional, and yet he acted like the world was his for the taking. I began to hate him not just for what he had done with Rachel, but for his arrogance, for daring to walk into my class with that smug look on his face, as if he hadn't already betrayed me in the worst possible way. I would watch him during lectures, trying to hide the contempt bubbling under my skin. He had no idea that I knew. No idea that the man standing at the front of the room, grading his papers, held the key to his future. He thought he could waltz through life untouched, that his actions had no consequences. But he was wrong. His fate was sealed the moment he decided to step into my world and take something that wasn't his. As the exam season drew closer, the tension in the room began to rise. Students were buzzing with the usual anxiety, cramming for their final assessments. And Oliver was no different. He had always been ambitious, and it was clear he had plans for his academic career beyond my class. His future hinged on these exams, and he was fully aware of that. He often stayed behind after lectures to ask questions, trying to squeeze out extra bits of information that might give him an edge. But all I could think about was how he had betrayed me, how he had smiled at Rachel in that cafe as if he had won some prize. Every time he came to me with a question, every time he sought my guidance, it took everything in me to keep my voice steady, to maintain the illusion of professionalism. He would never suspect that the man he was asking for help had already decided his fate. The day of the first exam arrived, and I watched Oliver as he entered the room, his usual confident swagger slightly diminished by the weight of the impending test. He took his seat at the front, as he always did, and I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. This was the beginning of the end for him, and he had no idea. As the students began their exams, I walked up and down the aisles, my eyes scanning the room. I stopped by Oliver's desk, pretending to check his progress, but just savoring the moment. He looked up briefly, giving me a polite nod before returning to his paper. His focus was admirable, but it wouldn't save him. I had already made up my mind. When it came time to grade the exams, I felt a surge of anticipation. Oliver's paper was average, nothing spectacular, but competent enough to pass under normal circumstances. But this time, normal didn't apply. I picked up my red pen and, with deliberate strokes, marked him down. Harshly. Answers that might have passed with a second glance were torn apart with brutal scrutiny. I was merciless, and with every incorrect mark, a part of me reveled in his impending downfall. The next few exams followed the same pattern. Oliver would work diligently, always pushing himself, unaware that no matter how hard he tried, he was already doomed. His grades steadily declined, each failure chipping away at his confidence. I could see the panic starting to set in. He began staying after class more frequently, his questions becoming more desperate. He couldn't understand why he was failing, and I offered him no comfort. I watched him grow more frustrated with each setback, his once assured demeanor cracking under the pressure. His future, the one he had probably been so sure of, was slipping through his fingers. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. And through it all, Rachel remained oblivious. She had no idea what I was doing, how her betrayal had sparked this slow, calculated destruction of her lover's future. As the final exam approached, I could see the fear in Oliver's eyes. He knew this was his last chance. If he didn't perform well, his academic career would be over. The internships, the scholarships, the glowing recommendations, everything he had been working towards, would vanish. He came to me one last time, asking if there was anything he could do, any way to make up for his poor performance in previous exams. I looked him in the eye, suppressing the urge to laugh. He had no idea that his failures were by my design. I told him to study hard, and that this final exam would be crucial. He thanked me, still hopeful that he could turn things around. But I knew better. The day had finally come. The final exams were graded, and the results were posted. The atmosphere on campus was tense. As it always was during this time of year. Students rushed to check their scores, nervously hovering around the results boards, some celebrating, others frowning in disappointment. But I wasn't interested in the crowd. My eyes were fixed on one person, Oliver. He approached the results board with the same confidence that had once made me loathe him. I watched from a distance as he scanned the list for his name. His face, usually so smug and self-assured, began to change as his eyes landed on his final grade. It was clear from the way his expression shifted that he had failed. Miserably. His confident posture wilted, his shoulders slumping as he stepped back from the board, his hand covering his mouth in shock. I had expected disappointment, maybe anger, but what I saw was something deeper, more satisfying, pure, unfiltered despair. His eyes widened, his face pale as if the world had just crumbled around him. I could see his mind racing, trying to comprehend how this had happened. Of course, he had no idea that his failure had been carefully orchestrated. I had made sure that he wouldn't just fail the exam, but that he would be left with no opportunity to make things right. No retake, no second chances. His future, at least the one he had been planning so meticulously, had just been ripped away from him, and there was nothing he could do about it. I had made sure of that. As Oliver stood there, staring blankly at the results, his face was etched with hopelessness, like someone who had just lost everything. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in, and I took a strange satisfaction in watching it unfold. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The culmination of weeks of carefully laid plans. The silent revenge I had nurtured in the darkest corners of my mind had finally bloomed into something real, and it was more satisfying than I could have imagined. In the days following the exam results, the weight of his failure began to crush him. I could see it in the way he carried himself, in the hollow look in his eyes as he walked through the halls. Gone was the self-assured student who once thought he could take what he wanted without consequence. In his place was a man on the edge, desperate and broken. One afternoon, he showed up at my office, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with the kind of desperation that made me almost pity him. Almost. He stammered as he tried to explain himself as if there had been some kind of mistake. "Professor, there has to be some kind of error. I've never failed like this before. Is there any way I can retake the exam? I'll do whatever it takes. I just need another chance." I sat behind my desk, staring at him with cold indifference. His words barely registered. All I could think about was how he had once looked at Rachel, how he had smiled and laughed with her as if I didn't exist. Now here he was, begging for mercy from the very man he had wronged. The irony was delicious. "I'm sorry, Oliver," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "There are no retakes. The results are final." His face fell, his last thread of hope snapping before my eyes. He didn't argue, didn't protest. He just stood there for a moment, looking like a man who had been sentenced to a life he never expected. He thanked me quietly, though the words were empty, and turned to leave. As he walked away, I heard him mutter something to himself. He wasn't just failing a class. This failure meant far more. I knew he had been counting on this grade to secure an internship. One that would have opened doors for him. Without it, those opportunities would vanish. And that wasn't the end of it. His dream of attending graduate school, of building the career he had worked for, was now slipping through his fingers, thanks to my carefully measured cruelty. I overheard him talking to his friends a few days later, his voice shaking with panic. "I don't know what I'm going to do," he said. "Without this grade, I've lost my chance at the internship. They've already told me I can't apply without passing. And grad school's off the table if I don't fix this. Everything I've worked for, it's all falling apart." His friends tried to reassure him, telling him there must be some way to appeal, but Oliver knew the truth. His academic career was over before it had even truly begun. He had gambled on his success, and now he was watching everything he had hoped for disappear, slipping through his hands like sand. Each time I saw him after that, he seemed smaller, more defeated. The confident, arrogant young man who had once thought he could steal what he wanted without consequence was gone. In his place was someone broken, unsure of himself, clinging desperately to the remnants of a future he no longer controlled. And I watched it all unfold with a quiet satisfaction. Oliver had no idea why this was happening to him. No idea that every step of his downfall had been planned. He was paying the price for his betrayal, just as I had intended. And it wasn't over yet. It didn't take long for Rachel to notice the change in me. After all, she wasn't blind. For weeks, I had distanced myself emotionally, and my conversations with her reduced to cold, minimal exchanges. The quiet contempt I held for her simmered just beneath the surface, but I kept it in check. I didn't shout, didn't accuse her outright. Instead, I let my silence speak for me, and it unsettled her. She began to ask questions. Is something wrong? She'd ask, her voice laced with concern. But I would brush her off. Just work, I'd say, avoiding her eyes, knowing full well that she sensed something deeper. She tried harder, cooking elaborate meals, suggesting we go out, attempting to engage me in conversations that had once flowed so easily. But I remained distant. Every smile she offered, every kind word, felt like a mockery of the trust she had shattered. The tension between us was growing, and she could feel it. Yet she had no idea what was truly going on behind the mask I wore. She didn't know that I had already seen everything, that I had witnessed her betrayal with my own eyes, and that I was biding my time. The satisfaction I felt from watching her squirm was bitter, but it was mine. Then came the news of Oliver's failure. Rachel had always been careful to keep her relationship with him under wraps, but I knew the moment she found out. Her demeanor changed. The light, casual air she had once carried around me darkened with unease. She wasn't just concerned for him. She was scared of what his failure might mean for them both. One evening, she approached me, her eyes troubled. "Leo," she said quietly, her voice hesitant, "something's wrong with Oliver." I stayed silent, my heart racing beneath a mask of indifference. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. She shifted uneasily. He's failed all of his exams. I don't understand what happened. He was doing so well, and now, his whole academic career is at risk. Still, I said nothing, letting her words hang in the air between us. I could see the confusion in her eyes, the flicker of suspicion beginning to grow. She didn't know yet, but she was close. So close. Finally, she couldn't take the silence any longer. She leaned forward, her voice trembling with something like desperation. "Leo, there's something I need to tell you." I looked at her then, the coldness in my gaze making her flinch. "I know," I said, my voice steady, devoid of emotion. Her breath hitched, her face draining of color. For a moment, she seemed paralyzed, her mouth half open as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. You know?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," I said, my eyes locking with hers. "I've known for a while now." The weight of my words hit her like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "But how?" I didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch between us, watching as the realization dawned on her. She knew I had seen everything, the cafe, the messages, the stolen moments she thought she had hidden so well. I had seen it all, and now, she was finally understanding the full extent of what that meant. Rachel was stunned. Her mind raced as she tried to piece everything together, the carefully constructed web of lies unraveling right before her eyes. You've known this whole time?" she stammered, her voice quivering with disbelief. I nodded, my expression cold and detached. "Yes, I've known for weeks." She blinked rapidly, trying to process what I had just told her. "Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you confront me?" There was a mix of fear and guilt in her voice now, a tone she had never used with me before. She was no longer in control of the situation, and she knew it. "Because I didn't need to," I said quietly, my voice steady and measured. "I wanted you to see what it feels like when everything you've worked for, everything you care about, is taken from you." Her eyes widened as the full weight of my words sank in. "Oliver," she breathed, horror dawning on her. "You did this to him, didn't you? You failed him on purpose." I didn't deny it. I met her gaze, unflinching. "Yes." Her hand flew to her mouth as if trying to stifle a gasp, her body trembling with shock. How could you? How could I?" I repeated, my voice rising ever so slightly, the anger that I had buried for so long bubbling to the surface. How could you? You betrayed me, Rachel. You betrayed our marriage. And you expect me to feel sorry for your lover? Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head, trying to find the right words, but they wouldn't come. She was floundering, desperate to explain, to justify, but she knew there was no defense for what she had done. Leo, I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for this to happen. A mistake? I scoffed, the bitterness in my voice cutting through the air like a knife. You don't accidentally sleep with someone else, Rachel. You don't accidentally lie to your husband and sneak around behind his back. I was confused, she said, her voice breaking, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I never meant to hurt you. I stood up from the chair, the coldness in me hardening with every word she spoke. But you did, I said, my voice flat. And now you have to live with the consequences. She looked at me, desperation in her eyes. I love you, Leo. Please don't throw everything away because of one mistake. We can fix this. We can go to therapy, talk to someone. Figure this out together. But her words rang hollow. The damage had already been done. There was no fixing this. The trust, the foundation of our relationship, had been shattered beyond repair. There was no going back, no healing what had been so deeply broken. I'm not the one who threw it all away, I said, my voice cold and final. You did that the moment you chose him. She opened her mouth to protest, but I had already turned away, the distance between us growing wider with every step I took. I could hear her sobs behind me, but they didn't stir any sympathy in me. She had made her choices, and now we both had to live with them. There was no bridge left to cross between us, just an empty, yawning chasm that neither of us could ever hope to bridge again. Oliver is gone now. He left the university not long after his academic dreams crumbled under the weight of his failures. Word spread quickly that he had dropped out, unable to salvage the damage done to his grades, his future slipping away as swiftly as it had once seemed promising. No more internships, no more graduate school applications. Everything he had planned for his life shattered beyond repair. I didn't see him leave, but I heard about it through the usual university channels. The whispers of professors and students who wondered how such a bright, promising student could have fallen so far, so fast. No one knew the truth except for me. I had orchestrated his downfall with precision, and now, the damage was done. He was just another name lost in the sea of students who couldn't cut. As for Rachel, she carries the guilt like a weight she can never put down. I see it in her every day. She tries to hide it behind forced smiles and strained conversations, but I know it's there, lingering in the spaces between us. She blames herself for what happened to Oliver, and she should. After all, it was her affair that set everything in motion. But she also knows the truth, that it was my hand that delivered the final blow, that it was my decision that destroyed him. Our marriage? It's a ghost of what it once was. We still live under the same roof, but the house feels empty and hollow. We speak only when necessary, our conversations reduced to functional exchanges about bills, schedules, and mundane details of daily life. The warmth, the laughter, the connection we once had, it's all gone, replaced by a cold, silent distance that neither of us knows how to cross. Rachel tries sometimes, usually late at night when the silence between us becomes unbearable. She'll ask if we can talk if there's anything left to salvage. But I know, as well as she does, that the damage is too great. There's no fixing what's been broken. Too much has happened, too many betrayals, too much trust shattered. We are strangers now, living in the same space, but worlds apart. She's a different person too. The confident, vibrant woman I once loved now walks with a heaviness, weighed down by guilt and shame. I see it in her eyes every time she looks at me, a silent plea for forgiveness that I'm not willing, or perhaps not able, to give. She wants redemption, a way back to what we had, but there's no path forward for us anymore. She can't erase what she did, and I can't forget what I know. And me? What do I feel now that it's all over? Now that my revenge is complete? There was a time when I thought this moment would bring me some kind of closure, a sense of justice, or at least satisfaction. But as I sit here, in the quiet of our house, with Rachel's presence lingering like a shadow, I realize that what I feel is nothing. The rage, the betrayal, the need for retribution, they've all burned out, leaving behind an empty, hollow space where my emotions once were. I thought destroying Oliver's future would give me peace, and would somehow fill the void left by Rachel's betrayal. But now that it's done, I'm left with the stark realization that nothing has changed. I'm still here, in this cold, lifeless marriage, with no sense of victory, no sense of resolution. I got what I wanted. Oliver is gone, his life in ruins. But what has it cost me? The answer, I fear, is everything. My marriage is beyond repair, and I've become someone I barely recognize, calculating, cruel, consumed by bitterness. The revenge I once craved so deeply has left me feeling hollow, like I've lost a part of myself in the process. Rachel, too, has become a permanent reminder of everything that went wrong. Every glance, every word exchanged between us is tinged with the weight of our shared history, a history we can't escape, no matter how hard we try to pretend otherwise. We live together, but we are both alone, drifting in separate orbits that will never intersect again. In the end, I've won nothing. My revenge is complete, but instead of the satisfaction I imagined, all I'm left with is the emptiness of a life that's been torn apart. There's no going back, no undoing the damage I've done to Oliver, to Rachel, to myself. I wonder now if this is what I truly wanted. Did I ever really want revenge, or was I simply trying to mask the deeper pain of my loss? The truth is, I don't know anymore. All I know is that the silence in this house, between Rachel and me, is louder than anything I've ever heard.